Chapter 6. The second broadside of cannon shells fell closer. A spray of gravel and wooden splinters rattled against the viewport's grill, a smaller piece spilling through. Alex spat dirt from his mouth. "Vision to half!" Master Klopp cried. "Then curse it!" The two crewmen were below, and Volger was halfway up through the hatch again, his legs dangling from the ceiling. Klopp glanced apologetically at Alec. "If you please, Your Highness." "Certainly, Master Klopp," Alex said. He unbuckled and pulled himself up from the commander's chair. The cabin rocked and swayed, and he grasped the straps overhead to keep his footing. He tried to turn the viewport crank, but it wouldn't budge. Taking it with both hands, Alex strained harder until the massive armored visor grudgingly closed a few centimeters. Another broadside stroke shook the earth beneath them, and the walker staggered forward. Count Volger's riding boots flailed, kicking Alec in the back of the head. "They can still see us," Volger shouted from above. "We're too tall." Master Cloak twisted at the Saunter's hunkering the stormwalker lower. The hornbeam trees rose up in the viewport, the walker's clumsy gait sending Volger's boots swinging again. For the astonished moment, Alec watched Klopp's hands on the controls. I'd never seen a walker shuffle along in the crouch like this. Of course, he'd never imagined the Cyclops Stormwalker having to hide from anything, but against the dreadnought, this walker was practically a toy. Grunting and heaving, Alec managed to close the rear viewport to half. He reached for the other crank. "Young master, the antenna!" Klopp cried out. Of course, the Stormwalker's wireless antenna stretched up above the trees. The arch-dual flag snapped in the breeze, but Alec had no idea how to lower it. He looked around in the cabin, wished he'd paid more attention to the crewmen when learning to pilot. Finally, he spotted a windlass beside the wireless set. As he darted for it, Volger's dangling boots delivered another blow to the shoulder. The windlass spun wildly the moment Alec unlocked it, the antenna telescoping closer a few centimeters from his ear. He stared back to the commander's seat, then saw that the heavy viewport was still open. He reached across the lurching cabin and began to crank it tighter. Volger dropped back into the cabin, closing the hatch above him against the sudden rain of dirt and pebbles. We're out of sight now." Another broadside rumbled in the distance, followed by more explosions flickering among the trees ahead. Debris struck the Stormwalker, but the viewport's grill was squeezed as tight as comb teeth now. Only the fine dust of pulverizing forest floor filtered through. Alec felt a moment of satisfaction. He'd done something useful. This was the first real battle, when only hours before he'd been playing with his tin soldiers. The rumble of explosions and the creak of engines somehow filled this hollowness inside him. The Stormwalker was thrashing through the dense forest now. Of course, any cleared path would be clearly visible from the Beowulf-looking towers. Alec's heart was beating fast as he slipped back into the commander's chair and watched Klopp's hands on the Saunters. His long hours of piloting practice seemed suddenly trifle. All that time in runabouts had been pretend play, and this was real. Volger crouched between the chairs to peer forward, his face blackening with dirt and sweat. Blood flowed from the scratch above his eye, shining bright red in the gloom of the shuttered cabin. "I believe I suggested a smaller land ship, Master Klopp." Klopp barked a laugh, still struggling to keep the Stormwalker low to the ground. "Don't appreciate the extra armor, Volger?" A runabout would have been blown off her feet by the last broadside. The force rumbled again, but the explosion came from well behind and off to the right. The dreadnought had lost sight from them for now. The sun was rising behind the Beowulf. "So we're headed west," Alex said. "We should turn left. The pines and firs down in the south was are much taller than these hornbeams. Well remembered, Your Highness, Mr. Klopp said, adjusting his course. Alec clapped him on the shoulder. You were right to choose the Stormwalker, Klopp. We'd be dead by now otherwise. We'd be halfway to Switzerland, you mean, Volger said, managing to sound as if there were some fencing lessons that Alec was failing to comprehend. In a run about half of his size, or on horses, they wouldn't have spotted us in the first place. Alec glared up at the wild count, but before he could open his mouth, the intercom popped. Loaded and ready, sir. Alec dropped his gaze toward the cabin floor. Those two would have been more use up here. There's not much they can do with the pea shooter against the dreadnought. True, Your Highness, Klopp said, but she'll have escorts, smaller, faster ships moving below tree height. We may get a whiff of them sooner than you think. Ah, quite right. Alec closed his mouth and swallowed. The rush of battle was beginning to fade, and his hands were shaking. All he'd done was turn a few cranks. The others had handled everything important. The bruises left by Volger's swinging boots still throbbed, reminders of how Alec had mostly managed to get in the way. He leaned back into the commander's chair as the simple, overwhelming fear of being shot at faded. The emptiness was rushing back. Alec wished that it were him bleeding instead of Volger, anything to distract himself from the truth welling up in his mind. She's lost our range, Klopp said. No big guns for a Count of Thirsty. They've turned to give chase, Volger said, but wait till their scouts spot us. She'll swing around for another broadside soon enough. Alec cast about for something to say, but found himself in the grip of silent panic. His vision blurred with tears. The attack had swept away his last doubts. His father was dead, his mother too, both gone forever. His Serene Highness, Prince Alexander of Horenburg, was alone now. He might never see his home again. The armed forces of two empty empires were hunting him, set against one walker and 4 men. Volger and Klopp fell silent, and when Alec turned, he saw his despair reflected in their faces. He clenched the hand rests of the commander's chair, fighting to breathe. His father would have known what to say in this situation, a short of forceful speeches, praising the men for efforts, urging them to carry on, but Alec could only stare into the forest, blinking away tears. If he didn't say something, the emptiness would swallow him. A burst of gunfire broke out of the trees ahead, cutting through the grind of the engines. The walker twisted to a new heading, and Count Volger jumped to his feet again. Horse Scouts, I reckon, Master Klopp said. They have stables on the Beowulf. A shower of bullets rattled against the Stormwalker's visors, louder than any spray of dirt and pebbles. Alec imagined metal projectiles ripping through the armor and cutting into him, and his heart began to race again. The awful emptiness lifted a little. A huge broom shook the walker in its track, and the bellow of smoke rose across the viewport, its choking stench spilling into the cabin. For a moment, Alec thought they'd be hit. But then an explosion answered from the distance, followed by a crack of trees and the awful cries of horses. That was us, he murmured. The men below had fired the Stormwalker's cannon. As the echoes died, Volger called, "Do you know how to load a Spandau machine gun, Alec?" Prince Alexander knew nothing of the sort, but already his hands were moving to unbuckle his seat strap. Chapter 7. They were just beginning to reel in Darwin when Darren, okay, so this is another setting. Now we're back to Darren and her trying to maneuver the Huxley, the hot air balloon that looked like that they called Medusa. They were just beginning to reel in Darren when the storm struck. The ground had noticed the darkening sky. They were scrambling about the fields, scurrying the hangar tent with extra spikes, getting the recruits under cover. 4 men strained at the ascender's winch, pulling Darren down, steady and fast. A dozen ground crew waited to grab the beast's tentacles when it was low enough. But she was still 500 feet up when the first sheets of rain arrived. The cold drops fell diagonally, hitting her dangling feet, even under the cover of the air beast. Tentacles coiled tighter, and she wondered how long the Medusa would take this pounding before it spilled into its hydrogen, hurling itself toward the ground. "Stay calm, beastie," Darren said softly. "They're bringing us in." So they're trying to bring in the Medusa and Darren at the same time. The wild gust caught the Medusa's airbag and it bellowed like a full sail. Darren swung out into the full force of the storm. Her body slops instantly soaked with frozen rain. Then the cable snapped taut, whipped the beast earthward like a kite without enough string. It dropped toward the houses and yard gardens, down in it just above the high prison walls. Directly beneath Darren, people scurried along the wet streets, shoulders hunched, unaware of the monster overhead. Another gust of wind struck, and the Huxley was forced low enough that Darren could see the ribs of umbrellas below. "Oh, beastie, this isn't good." The Medusa swelled again, trying to regain its lift, and leveled off a few dozen feet above the rooftops. The cable strained again, the wind for a moment, then against the wind for a moment, then loosened. The ground men were giving them slack. Darren reckoned letting them climb a bit more, like a fisherman trying to keep a catch on the line. But the extra cable was more weight to carry, and she and the Huxley were both heavy with rain. She could spill the water ballast, but once it was gone, there'd be nothing left to slow their fall if the beasties panicked. The cable was scraping across the prison rooftops now, snapping against the shingles and drain pipes. Darren saw it snag on one of the smoky chimneys, and her eyes widened. No wonder the ground men were getting out more cable. They were keeping her away from the prison. If a chimney spark drifted up and reached the Huxley airbag, the hydrogen would ignite and ascenders exploding in a massive fireball, rain or no rain. The cable snagged again, sending a jolt through the Huxley. The creature spooked, its tentacles coiling tighter, and dropped again. Darren clenched the baluster cord, gritting her teeth. She might survive a wind-tossed landing herself, but the shingled rooftops, the backyard fences below which would shred the creature to pieces, and it would be all Darren Sharp's fault for not warning the ground men when she'd had a chance. Some air sense. "Okay, beastie," she called up. "I may have got you into this mess, but I'm going to get you out of it too. And I'm telling you now, now's not the time to panic." The creature made no promises, but Darren pulled the ballast cords away. The bag snapped open, spilling their water into the storm. Slowly the air beast began to climb. The ground men gave a cheer and set upon the wrench fiercely, hauling the air beast in against the wind. The captain was supervising, shouting orders from the back of the air-terrain carriage, the tigress looking miserable in the rain, like a pair of house cats standing under the faucet. Jasper was running across the field toward her, clapping his hands, and his mouth was shouting something. She caught the sound of his voice, but the wind whipped the words away. Darren's feet now dangling a few yards above the ground. She raced by as if she was on horseback. She peeled off the heavy sodded jacket and tossed it overboard. The prison loomed close again as the Huxley sped along. Smashing into the walls at this speed would turn her and the air beast into bloody splotches. Her fingers scrambled at the pilot's rig, searching for a way to escape to the harness. Darren reckoned her chances were better dropping onto muddy grass than clashing into the wall.